Good evening, everyone. I am Samira Alana, and welcome to our special presentation on the Rio Tinto's destruction of the Juukan Caves, which is one of Australia's most significant archaeological research sites, showing evidence of continuous human habitation dating back nearly 46,000 years. It was said that Rio Tinto gave misleading information to the Puutu Kunti Kurrama Pinikura, the PKKP people, during negotiations to halt the blast. However, the blasts went ahead even after a delay was promised. Recently, it was announced that the CEO of Rio Tinto, Jean-Sébastien Jacques, will be stepping down by end of March next year. In our panel, we have Raf, an expert in Australian Indigenous history, Shobit, an expert in mining, Stephanie, an expert in law, and Kristen, reporter who's been covering the case. Raf, I will start with you. Could you give us the significance of the Aboriginal heritage sites, please?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks very much for having me today, Samira. So honing in on the specific incidents, I think it's important for us to place the relevance of the PKK people in these caves into historical context. The rock shelters in the Juukan Gorge have been continuously inhabited for the past 46,000 years by the PKK people, and that includes all the way through the last ice age up until today. And the cave itself is the oldest in Australia's Pilbara region. Excavations, in fact, unearthed a bevy of recent precious artifacts or historical artifacts, some of which include a 4,000-year-old lock of hair, which connects the historical inhabitants of the site to the PKK people of today. So, these aren't just caves, but they're arguably some of the most important historical sites in all of Australia.
Interesting, since this is obviously very important to the PKKP. Rio Tinto has been working on this mine since 2010, I believe, and has invested nearly $2 billion. This is quite significant. Shobit, could you please give a brief history on Rio Tinto and some insight on why this is so important?
Hi, Samira. Good evening, everyone. Yes, absolutely. So, started in 1873, Rio Tinto is a public traded company and is world third largest mining company. Head office based out of both the UK and Australia. Rio Tinto have five major area or expertise in mining: aluminum, copper, diamond, industrial minerals, energy minerals like coal and uranium, and finally iron ore. In Australia alone, Rio Tinto have approximately 15,000 employees, and out of those 15,000, 1,500 are from Aboriginal community. Juukan Gorge is a gorge found in a remote pilgrim region of Western Australia. It is an economic powerhouse for mining, especially for Australian economy. Rio Tinto is the biggest mining company in Australia, who have active 16 mines right now. Moreover, one of those mines is Bulkman 4 iron ore mine located next to the Juukan Gorge. In recent news, and it has definitely not been in favor of Rio Tinto for Australian mining legislative, as well as specifically highlighting Section 18 of Aboriginal Heritage Act, which is ACA.
So Shobit, I'm just going to stop you right there. So I know we will talk about that some more later. Stephanie, could you please fill us in on Section 18?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Samira. Thanks so much for having me. So there's always a challenge when governments are trying to balance the right of exploration companies to extract natural resources and the cultural rights of Aboriginals who are trying to protect their history, especially when this doesn't extend to mineral rights. And this is the case in many countries, not just Australia. And in Australia, though, it is generally the territory or state governments that enact legislation that protects these cultural sites. And in Western Australia, it is the Aboriginal Heritage Act of 1972, which provides provisions for the protection of recognized and unrecognized Aboriginal sites of significance. And I think we can agree from the archaeological studies to date that the Juukan 1 and Juukan 2 sites would certainly qualify under this act. And as Shobit alluded to, in particular in this act is Section 18, which allows a landowner to apply for permission to alter, destroy, or damage an Aboriginal site of significance. And this is what Rio Tinto did in this case in October of 2013. They submitted their archaeological survey and notified the PKKP peoples that they had submitted this to ministry with the intent to obtain approval to destroy this site. And that is what was granted to them in December of 2013. They did receive permission to damage these sites. And so really they were within the legal framework to do so when the explosion took place in earlier this year. However, I think we could discuss whether it was ethical for them to do so in light of the new evidence that came forth in 2014.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I'm going to go back to Raf over here. So could you please give me more information on the archaeological surveys pertaining to the Brockman site, Raf?
Yeah, absolutely. So the surveys have been conducted on a semi-ongoing basis all the way from 2003 to 2017, almost every 2 to 4 years. But it wasn't until 2013, 2014 that we saw a change in the material significance of the Juukan sites. And that's when we identified the Juukan 2 cave as one of the most significant archaeological sites in all of Australia. So, and at this point, that's where we think that Rio Tinto should have reconsidered the mine, because it's at that point that they found the 46,000-year-old history of the site. So, as my counterpart Stephanie can probably speak to a little bit better, but once the approval is granted, there's no real legal mechanism for the PKKP people to go back and say that, you know what, we should hit pause on this excavation once they'd realized the historical value of the site.
Yeah, Raf, I'd be happy to elaborate on that. So back in March of 2011, Rio Tinto and the PKKP peoples entered into a participation agreement which provided consent to access the expanded Brockman 4 site in exchange for financial and non-financial benefits to the PKKP peoples. These agreements are extremely complex. They're typically very long, and this is industry standard, but it does raise questions as to whether there's full understanding of what this entails and whether there's significant recourse for these peoples if new material does come to light at a later date. So this is definitely something worth considering in the future on how we proceed with such agreements.
Yeah, and not to belabor the point, but I'll add to that. We're talking about a 714-page legal agreement here. The PKK people, they don't necessarily have the legal resources or the wherewithal to go up against Rio Tinto here. It's kind of a David and Goliath thing where, and in fact, Rio Tinto subsidized part of the PKK people's legal fees for this matter. And at the heart of the issue here, we have several years where Rio Tinto was stating that the PKK people weren't formally objecting to any of the processes here and weren't objecting to development. But at the same time, Rio Tinto funded a documentary in, I think, 2016, where we had Indigenous people in Australia, specifically PKKP, talking about how companies like Rio Tinto are destroying culturally and historically significant sites all across Australia. So, we have a little bit of a disconnect here with regards to how these matters are being handled.
Yes, definitely. When we have the history nicely laid out, it doesn't appear that there should have been any surprises when Rio Tinto proceeded with their plan to blow up their mine site. However, this was not the case. I do know that. So, Kristen, could you please fill us in?
Yes, of course. So I have for you here a timeline of the days immediately leading up to the destruction of the Juukan Caves. There's a couple of dates I really want to highlight here. The first is May 14th. The PKKP tribe had a meeting with Rio Tinto on this date, requesting access at a future date for a celebration they were holding. Rio Tinto at this meeting did not mention that they were planning on destroying this site in several days' time. They also failed to mention that they had already started drilling and loading blast holes. On May 15th, Rio Tinto did notify the PKKP that they would be destroying the site, but said at that time they would put things on hold while the PKKP was able to gather additional information. Now, Samira, let me ask you, when I say I'm going to put things on hold, what does that mean to you?
That you're going to put things on hold.
I would think the same thing. Unfortunately, what Rio Tinto did was continue to drill and load blast holes. We fast forward to May 21st, senior leadership at Rio Tinto has a meeting, and they realize that they are too far along in the process and they have no choice but to proceed with destroying the site.
So I'll stop you right there, Kristen. So Shobit, do you have any additional comments here?
Yes, thank you, Samira. So for the local audience, in order to understand that there are some big words thrown into this discussion, like explosive, detonation, and the charges, I want to make sure the audience understand that these are very common practices in the industry. Mining industry as an overall, this is viewed as the most practical way of mining the resources. And without getting into the controversial part of it, which my colleagues already have discussed about, is I want to highlight this specific instance. Rio Tinto, by the time they came to know that the importance of this site, they already did plant explosive in the ground. And just like anything else, explosive have a shelf life. In this case, it was 14 days. By the time they came to know, the experts were brought into the matter, and the answer which they got was not very different what they expected. So historically, when the explosive are planted into the ground, it is practically impossible to pull those explosive out safely. And there are high chance of that project failing rather than success. And because the chances of, when we calculate the ratio of risks involved, the easiest and the best option in everyone's favor is go forward with the explosive. And now coming back to the shelf life, unfortunately, when these explosives were planted, the 24th of May 2020 was the day when Rio Tinto, the government, and the expert decided that they have to move forward with this detonation. And unfortunately, the collateral damage was all these historical rock shelter and historical heritage sites were destroyed.
That is very unfortunate. Okay, let's go back to Kristen and talk about the aftermath. Kristen?
Thank you. So what I have not yet mentioned is that the PKKP was under a gag order. So as part of their original agreement, they were not allowed to talk about what was happening. So you may be wondering why you hadn't heard of this before the site was destroyed. That's why. So on May 25th, the PKKP was able to release a public statement. Of course, they shared how significant the site was, and the world was outraged at this destruction. That resulted in a couple of things. So the first is that Rio Tinto did conduct an internal investigation. They did want to keep this quiet. Of course, they didn't want to share the results, but they were under a lot of shareholder pressure to share that publicly. So out of it, of course, came, some negative things, but a couple of the positive things are that they will be forming subcommittees going forward, executive subcommittees. So that should help prevent the destruction of future heritage sites. Okay. They also are in support of legislative changes so that Aboriginal tribes are able to appeal these decisions to destroy the heritage sites. Of course, as you mentioned, there is a Senate inquiry happening as we speak. Revelations, testimony comes out of that every day. A few of the ones that really are important for our discussion today is first that Rio Tinto has now acknowledged that they should not have been laying explosives during this process. Once they said they were going to put things on hold, it should have been on hold. Okay. The other one is they are acknowledging that there were failures to communicate within the senior management teams. So survey results did not make it where they should be.
So we're coming to the end of our time, but I'd like to give everyone a chance to tell me what they think should result from this incident. Personally, I think the first thing that does need to happen is to strengthen Rio Tinto's partnership with the PKKP. They should also ensure the strengthening of governance and have stringent approvals in place on Indigenous communities. I will start with Raf. Raf, what do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, all affected stakeholders, Indigenous otherwise, should have a voice in these developments. And specific to this, we see Indigenous peoples again and again all over the world seeing the same kind of David and Goliath fight. As a matter of fact, right now in the United States, Rio Tinto is planning on building the world's largest copper mine on lands in Arizona that are considered sacred to the Apache people. So, I think there needs to be a recognition of legal thresholds versus ethical thresholds. And I think that large companies need to be held a little bit more accountable.
Raf. Shobit, what do you think?
So being an expert from the mining industry, I think the first and foremost thing is we need to hold industry accountable. We are facing with new and unique challenges, especially when we talk about heritage site, places with unique or special importance. I think as an industry, we need to find ways to work with local government, local communities, where we can preserve these sites, but at the same time, not halt the growth of this industry itself, because it provides a lot of valuable resources as well as employment for thousands and thousands of people. So we, as a industry, we just need to find more ways to grow and bring everyone on board and work together with everyone.
Thank you, Shobit. Stephanie, what do you think?
Yeah, so this public inquiry really has brought to light some of the industry practices and some potential areas for improvement to ensure that this doesn't happen again. So this includes, with the long development timelines for these mines, having flexibility in the agreements and a really clear appeals process. And there is a new Aboriginal Heritage Act bill that is under consideration right now. So I think this is a really great opportunity to make sure that we clarify what information should be submitted to ensure that there really is clear communication between industry, the government, and the Aboriginal people within Australia.
Thank you, Stephanie. And finally, Kristen, what do you think?
I think it's important that any legislative changes really recognize the power imbalance between the huge Rio Tinto and the smaller Aboriginal tribes. So I think it's absolutely important we recognize this imbalance so that the legislation can be as effective as possible.
Yes, definitely. This was great, and I appreciate your participation. Thank you, everyone, for coming today and providing your expertise on this issue. I hope this was informative for everyone. I know how busy you all are, so I'm grateful that you all took the time to prepare and spend an evening with me. Have a great evening, everyone.